Texas, 1888. Rosalind Bell had waited tables at the Millbrook Saloon and Restaurant since she was 17 years old, carrying trays of coffee and stew between men twice her age with the same steady composure she'd carried most things in her life, quietly, without complaint, because complaint had never once put food on a table or a roof over her head. She was an orphan, and had been for as long as she could properly remember. Her mother had died when Rosalind was 6, of a fever that took hold fast and left nothing behind but a handful of memories and a single, often repeated story about a ring, rare and beautiful, set with a large green stone that her mother had once worn and had been forced to part with shortly before the end came. "It was the finest thing I ever owned," her mother used to say, turning the memory over like a keepsake she couldn't quite let go of. "Traded it away in a hard winter, when we needed the money more than the shine of it. I don't regret the trading. I only wish I'd had it a little longer to look at." Rosalind had grown up in a church orphanage after that, and had worked for her keep since she was old enough to carry a full tray without spilling it. She kept the mercantile's weekly order sheets in her head better than the cook did, caught a short-change delivery of flour twice that year before anyone else noticed, and had begun, quietly, saving what little she could toward a small hope she hadn't told a soul, a respectable boarding house of her own, someday, run properly, the kind of place that would have taken in a woman like her mother without judgment. She didn't dwell on the ring most days. It was simply a small, sad thread of her mother's voice she kept, because it was one of the few threads she had left. That was, until the richest rancher in Texas walked through the saloon door. August Renwick was 55 years old, and Millbrook, like most of the state, knew his name the way it knew the weather, as a fact of daily life, unavoidable and often discussed. His herds supplied 3 rail depots a season. His name sat on the letterhead of 2 banks. He carried himself with the quiet, weathered authority of a man who'd spent 30 years building something enormous out of very little, and who'd learned, along the way, to trust almost no one with the reasons why. He came into the saloon that afternoon on ordinary business, a meeting with a cattle buyer that had run long, and took a table near the window, tired enough that he barely noticed the young waitress setting down his coffee until the cup rattled softly against its saucer. It was his hand, resting on the table beside the cup, that caught Rosalind's eye. A ring, gold, set with a large green stone, worn smooth with age on his smallest finger. She went very still. "Sir," she said before she could stop herself, "my mother had a ring like yours." August Renwick froze. He looked up at her slowly, and Rosalind, watching his face change, understood that she'd said something considerably larger than she'd intended. "Where?" he said, his voice carefully even. "Did your mother come by a ring like this one?" "I don't rightly know, sir," Rosalind said. "She never said. Only that it was the finest thing she'd ever owned, and that she gave it up, traded it, I believe, the winter before she passed." August didn't leave after his coffee that afternoon. He ordered a second cup, and then, some while later, a third, until Rosalind finally set the pot down on his table without being asked. "At this rate, sir," she said, "sleep may become a distant memory." "I find I'm not much interested in sleep just now," August said, and asked her, carefully, what her mother's name had been. "Evangeline," Rosalind said. "Evangeline Bell, though I've since wondered if Bell was truly hers, or only a name she took on when she needed one." August set down his cup very carefully, as though the table itself might not be steady enough to hold it. He thanked her, left considerably more than the meal required, and rode home with a name circling in his mind he hadn't allowed himself to say aloud in over 20 years. He came back the following afternoon, before he'd made any sense at all of what he intended to do with the answers he was hoping for. He ordered coffee he didn't drink, and asked Rosalind, as carefully as a man could manage such questions without alarming the person he was asking them of, where she'd been born, how old she'd been when her mother died, whether Evangeline had ever spoken of Texas, and whether any letters, photographs, or keepsakes had survived beyond the story of the ring. Rosalind answered the first two questions plainly enough, then set down the coffee pot and looked at him directly. "Sir," she said, "did you come back today for the food or for my mother's story?"
August looked at the full cup in front of him, untouched and gone cold. "Today," he admitted, "I believe I came for both, though I owe you a great deal more explaining than I've given you so far." "I've got a saloon to run," Rosalind said, not unkindly. "Whatever explaining you owe me, you'd best decide soon whether you mean to give it." He didn't explain himself that day either. Not yet, not until he was certain of what he was chasing, but he rode home turning the name over and over. Thoughtful, Evangeline Sterling, not Belle Sterling, the daughter of a family whose land had bordered his father's, back when there'd been 2 ranches in that stretch of country instead of 1. He had loved her since they were both young enough that loving someone hadn't yet felt like a decision with consequences attached to it, since summers spent racing horses along the fence line that divided their 2 families' land, since a courtship conducted mostly in stolen afternoons, because both fathers had strong opinions about a proper engagement, and neither August nor Evangeline had much patience for waiting on them. He had searched for her once, long ago, though he rarely let himself remember how thoroughly that search had failed. In the months after she vanished, he had ridden to the old Sterling property himself, found the house already sold, the fields already under some stranger's plow, and not a soul left in the county who could tell him where the family had gone. He'd written to 2 cousins of hers in San Antonio, both of whom claimed politely, and with what he'd believed at the time was genuine regret, to know nothing of Evangeline's whereabouts. He'd paid a stage line agent in the county seat for information, and been told with real confidence that a woman matching her description had boarded a coach bound for New Orleans that same spring. He'd followed that lead for 3 weeks, a hard, expensive chase across half of Louisiana, sleeping in coach stations and boarding houses, showing her description to every clerk and innkeeper along the route, before he'd finally stood in a New Orleans boarding house that had never once in all its years of business heard the name Sterling spoken under its roof. He had ridden home from that trip a different man than the one who'd left, quieter, more careful, considerably less willing to trust his own certainty about anything. For 22 years, he'd believed his search had simply failed. It was only now, going through the old stage line receipts he'd kept in a desk drawer without knowing why, that he understood something considerably worse. Someone had led every step of that search in exactly the wrong direction on purpose. He began, that same week, going through records he hadn't touched in decades. His father's old ledgers, correspondence from the year the Sterling Ranch changed hands, and the settlement papers dividing his father's estate between his 2 sons. The estate division, at least, was plain enough. August had inherited the ranch itself and its herds, the working heart of the family's wealth. Cornelius, the elder brother, passed over for the ranch's management on the grounds of temperament rather than birthright, had received instead a considerable sum in cash, notes, and a stake in the family's lending interests. Money enough, August now understood with a cold, sinking clarity, to have financed exactly the kind of debt that could ruin a neighboring family within a single season. He sent for Elias Kirby, the family's old accountant, retired 11 years now, but still sharp enough to recognize his own handwriting in a column of figures decades old. The old man came out to the ranch, spread the ledgers across August's desk, and traced the debt entry with one weathered finger. "Your brother called this note early," Kirby said, "considerably earlier than the terms allowed. I remember thinking it peculiar at the time, though it wasn't my place to question a Renwick's business." "Why didn't you?" August asked. "Your brother always said numbers don't lie," Kirby said. "I've come to learn, in my old age, that men lie with numbers every day of the week. I simply hadn't the courage back then to say so to his face." August closed the ledger. "You have my leave to say it now." Kirby's memory, once loosened, proved considerably more useful than the ledgers alone. He recalled, dimly, a holding company Cornelius had used for 2 or 3 land purchases in those years, a name borrowed, Kirby believed, from a mining venture that had never actually operated. Curious. A morning spent at the county recorder's office confirmed it. The Sterling acreage hadn't passed to some unknown buyer at auction. It had been purchased, quietly, through that same small holding company, and 6 years after Cornelius's death, when his remaining interests had been folded back into the family estate. That same land had come to August without his ever once questioning where the extra acreage bordering his southern pasture had originated. Surprised, he had been grazing cattle on Evangeline's family's stolen land for the better part of a decade without knowing it. August sat with the ledgers late into that night, understanding, slowly, that his fortune hadn't merely grown alongside an old injustice. Some real portion of it had grown directly from one. It was in a trunk of Cornelius's old effects, kept in the ranch's attic since his death 8 years before, that August found them, not 11 letters, but 3, tucked in among the very same debt papers that recorded the Sterling Ranch's ruin, as though Cornelius had kept them together deliberately, evidence of a single plan rather than a stray discovery. All 3 were addressed to August. All 3 were in Evangeline's hand. None had ever been opened. His hands shook, breaking the first seal. The earliest was full of a hope that hadn't yet curdled into fear. She wrote of the ranch, of her father's temper, of a promise August had apparently made her once about the house they'd build together. "You swore the porch would face west so you could watch the herd come in at evening," she'd written. "I still expect you to keep that promise, whatever it costs the kitchen's morning light." She teased him, too, about a standing joke between them, his stubborn insistence on drinking his coffee black and strong, and her equally stubborn refusal to touch a cup of chicory no matter how many times he pressed it on her as a joke. The second letter, written some weeks later, carried a harder edge. Her family's ranch was gone. They were leaving Texas within days. She'd written that she had news too important for paper, though circumstance had left her no better way to try reaching him. The third and final letter, dated 2 months after that, was the shortest and the hardest to read. "I will raise the child alone if I must," Evangeline had written. "I have waited as long as I dare for a reply that has not come. I do not ask you for money, August. I ask only whether there is still a place for us in the life you've chosen. Before I let myself stop hoping there might be, I have named a town to write to, should you ever wish to find us. Father Whitfield at the Mission Church in Concordia will know where we've gone. Whatever becomes of us after this." August read that last letter 4 times before the shape of it fully settled into place, struck less by the pain in it than by the plain, stubborn warmth of the woman who'd written all 3 a warmth entirely undiminished, even at the end, by whatever hardship had followed. He sent a telegram to the parish in Concordia the following morning, and when 3 days passed without reply, he rode there himself. 2 full days in the saddle, across a stretch of country he'd never once had reason to cross before, sleeping the first night in a line shack and the second under open sky, the 3 letters riding in his coat pocket the whole way. Concordia turned out to be smaller than he'd pictured, a handful of streets, a mission church with a bell tower visible from a mile out, and a graveyard behind it he made himself not look at too closely until he had reason to. Father Whitfield had retired years earlier and passed on the year before, but the mission's current priest, a younger man named Father Alonso with a careful memory for his predecessor's records, walked August through the parish register himself, candle in hand, down shelves of ledgers going back 40 years. Whitfield kept meticulous books, Father Alonso said, running a finger down a page of close, careful handwriting. Baptisms, burials, marriages, even the families he simply fed through a hard winter. He believed a record properly kept was a kindness to whoever came looking later. They found the baptism first, a daughter born to one Evangeline Bell, unmarried, in the correct year and very nearly the correct month by August's own private reckoning. The child's name was recorded plainly: Rosalind Bell. August had read thousands of names across contracts, cattle brands, and deeds in 30 years of business. Not one of them had ever made his hand tremble the way that single line did. Beneath it, in the same careful hand 6 years later, was a second entry he wasn't prepared to read. The burial record gave a date, a cause: fever, the same fever Rosalind had always known killed her mother, and the name of the small cemetery behind the mission where Evangeline Sterling, recorded there under the name she'd taken to protect what little she had left, had been laid to rest 16 years before. August walked out to that small cemetery before he left Concordia, found the marker easily enough among the modest rows, and stood there a long while without quite knowing what a man was meant to do in front of a grave he hadn't visited in 16 years, because he hadn't known it existed. He didn't kneel. He didn't speak aloud. He only stood, hat in hand, until the light began to change, and then rode for home. He did not go to the saloon right away. He sat instead at his desk for 3 nights running, a fresh sheet of paper in front of him each evening. The first night he wrote 2 lines, "Dear Miss Bell, I believe I may be your father," before crossing them out so hard the pen tore through the page. The second night, he abandoned half a page of careful explanation, understanding that no amount of writing could soften what he was about to tell her. The third night, he simply sat with the letters and the copied records until the lamp burned low, understanding finally that some truths weren't meant to be delivered on paper by a man too much a coward to say them plainly to her face.
Before we go on, tell us where you're listening from today. And if this story has kept you company this afternoon, leave a like for August and Rosalind. Now let's get back, because August has just confirmed who Rosalind truly is, and the hardest part of this story is still ahead of him, finding the courage to tell her. He came to the saloon on the 4th evening, later than usual, when the supper crowd had mostly cleared, and Rosalind was wiping down the last of the tables. "Mr. Renwick," she said, "back for more coffee?" "No," August said. "I came because you deserve to hear this from me, and no one else." Rosalind didn't sit down right away. She stood with the rag still in her hand, arms crossed, and waited. August set a small wooden box on the table between them, the 3 letters, a copied page from the parish register, a jeweler's receipt from a San Antonio shop, and, resting carefully on top, a small photograph of a young woman laughing at something outside the frame, her hair loose in the wind. "That's her," Rosalind said quietly, picking up the photograph. "That's exactly how she used to look when she thought no one was watching her worry." She finally sat. He told her plainly, Evangeline Sterling, the secret engagement, his brother's debt and the stolen land, the 3 unopened letters, the parish register in Concordia. "Your mother's name was Evangeline Sterling," he said. "She and I meant to marry. My brother made certain her letters never reached me, and made certain, when I searched for her myself, that I searched in every direction but the right one." He slid the baptismal copy across the table. "The date matches what I've calculated 100 times these past weeks. The name is yours." A long silence settled over the table before either of them spoke again. "You had 22 years to be my father," Rosalind said finally. "No," August said. "I had 22 years without knowing I needed to be, and I know that doesn't return a single one of them to you." 22 years, she said again, quieter this time. "A ranch, a father, something more than an orphanage floor and other people's hand-me-downs, and instead I scrubbed dishes because your brother didn't want me to exist." "Yes," August said. He didn't soften it. "I won't pretend that isn't the truth, or ask you to forgive it quickly. I only want you to know I didn't choose this." "That's a very tidy thing to say now that your brother's 8 years dead and can't answer for himself," Rosalind said, grief and anger tangled too closely together to separate cleanly. "It is," August agreed. "I don't have a way to make that easier. I only have the truth, and whatever amends you'll allow me to make once you've had time to be properly angry about it." She didn't call him anything that night beyond Mr. Renwick. She took the box home and read her mother's letters until well past midnight. He made his first real mistake 3 weeks later, when Rosalind finally agreed to ride out and see the ranch for herself. August had spent those 3 weeks preparing, a room made up, new dresses ordered from a San Antonio dressmaker, her name already entered into the estate's household ledger, a place set permanently at his table, and word quietly passed to the staff to address her as Miss Renwick. Rosalind stood in the doorway of the room he'd prepared and went very quiet.
"You furnished a room for the daughter you imagined," she said finally. "You never once asked what the woman standing in front of you actually wanted." August opened his mouth to explain and then, watching her face, closed it again. "You're right," he said. "I've spent 30 years solving problems by throwing money and authority at them until they stopped being problems. I did the same thing here without noticing." Rosalind left before supper that evening and didn't come back for 11 days. When he finally rode into town again, he came without gifts of any kind. He found her at the saloon counter and set down only a single item, the second photograph of Evangeline he'd found tucked behind the first, one Rosalind hadn't yet seen. "Curious. No more dresses?" Rosalind said, arching an eyebrow at his empty hands. "I was informed, rather plainly, that dresses don't correct 22 years, August said. For the first time since the revelation, something close to a smile crossed her face. Sighs. "No," she agreed. "They don't. But I suppose it's a start, you noticing that." "Tell me what you'd actually want instead of what I imagine you ought to want," August said, "and I'll try to listen this time." "I don't know yet," Rosalind admitted, "but I'd rather figure it out slowly than be handed a life I never chose." She came back to the ranch a week later, on her own terms this time, and stayed through a full midday meal with the hands crowded around the long bunkhouse table. The first time, August realized, watching her trade easy conversation with men who worked for him, that she'd seemed entirely at ease on his land. A gelding in the South Corral, notoriously suspicious of strangers, walked straight past two ranch hands to nose at the apple Rosalind offered without being asked. "He's never trusted a stranger in his life," August said, watching. "Perhaps he's got better judgment than most people," Rosalind said, scratching the horse's nose without any particular ceremony about it. In the kitchen afterward, she glanced once at the week's flour and sugar order pinned to the wall and found an error in the column within a minute, correcting it without raising her voice. "You found in 10 minutes an error my foreman didn't catch in 3 months, August said. "Your foreman never spent 15 years counting coins to know whether there was still enough for flour," Rosalind said. "A person learns to see mistakes quick when there's not much room for one." It was old Kirby, visiting that same afternoon to finish some remaining paperwork, who stopped mid-sentence watching her tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear while she worked. "Forgive me," he said quietly to August once Rosalind had stepped out. "She has her mother's exact same gesture. I hadn't expected it to catch me so plainly after all these years." August said nothing, though he filed the moment away with the same careful attention he gave anything that told him something true. It was on the porch that evening, over coffee she'd made herself, that she finally asked the question she'd clearly been saving. "What was she like?" Rosalind said. "Not the woman in the letters, before all that, when you knew her as a girl." August considered the question a long moment. "Stubborn," he said. "Faster on a horse than I ever was, and never once let me forget it. She hated chicory coffee so much she'd pour it out behind the barn rather than drink it, and pretend to her mother she'd finished the cup. She used to say I took life too seriously for a man who owned as much land as I did. I expect she was right about that." "I don't remember her laughing much," Rosalind admitted. "By the time I was old enough to remember things clearly, we were already poor, and laughing didn't come as easy to her." "I'm sorry you never got to know the version of her I did," August said. "I think you'd have liked her considerably more than you'd have liked me." "Maybe," Rosalind said. "Though I'm starting to think I might tolerate you too, given enough time." It wasn't forgiveness. It was something to build forgiveness on top of, which was considerably more than he'd let himself hope for a month before. He called her to the ranch office the following week, not to hand her a gift, but to lay out plainly what he'd found, which acres had belonged to the Sterlings, how Cornelius had taken them, and what they'd produced in the years since. Thoughtful. "I want to correct this properly," August said, "not simply write you a check and call the matter settled." "I don't want to be paid to forgive you," Rosalind said. "I'm not paying for your forgiveness," August said. "I'm returning something that never should have come into my hands in the first place. Those are different things, whatever it looks like from where you're standing." She accepted, in the end, on her own conditions, that she would manage the land herself rather than have it managed for her, that a portion of whatever it earned would go toward the orphanage that had raised her, and that she'd continue working until she'd learned the business well enough to trust her own judgment over anyone else's, including his. The trouble came a few weeks later when Rosalind learned, secondhand from a bank clerk, rather than from August himself, that he'd already instructed his lawyer to name her as his heir. She rode out to the ranch, angrier than she'd been since the night in the saloon. "You did it again," she said. "Decided something enormous about my life, and told a lawyer before you told me." "I was trying to protect you," August said. "If anything happened to me before matters were settled properly." "That's not the point, and you know it," Rosalind said. "I need you to ask me things, August, not decide them and inform me afterward like I'm a line item in one of your ledgers." August was quiet a long moment. "I've spent my whole life commanding men, land, and cattle," he said finally. "It seems I forgot that a family isn't something a man commands." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry. I'll have the lawyer wait until you're ready to be part of that decision, not simply informed of it. It was a small thing, in the end, set right within the week. But it taught them both something the ledgers and letters never could have, that trust, once broken even accidentally, needed tending every bit as carefully as it needed building in the first place."
It was Rosalind, rereading her mother's first letter one evening, who noticed a detail she'd missed the first time through. A small mention of a mercantile owner in Concordia who'd shown Evangeline kindness during her hardest months. Together, she and August wrote to the man's descendants and learned that the ring had indeed been traded there in exchange for 6 months' provisions and a midwife's fee, and had passed unsold through 3 owners since the first, kept, oddly, by each in turn, as though something about its craftsmanship had made it difficult to part with. The current owner, once August explained the whole of it, agreed to sell it back for exactly what his grandfather had once paid for it in provisions, refusing to accept a cent more. August and Rosalind rode to Concordia together to collect it, the two of them making the same 2-day journey August had once made alone. And it was Rosalind who carried the small box back the whole way, unwilling to let it out of her sight. They returned to Concordia together that spring, to the small cemetery behind the mission, where August Renwick stood at Evangeline Sterling's grave for the first time in his life, 16 years after she'd been laid to rest there, and 22 years after he'd watched her disappear from it. Father Alonzo met them at the gate and left them alone without being asked. Rosalind knelt and pressed the ring's green stone gently against the carved letters of her mother's name. "I used to think about you every time she told that story," Rosalind said quietly. "I didn't know there was a ranch, or a man, or any of the rest of it. I only knew she loved you enough to keep the story alive long after she'd had to let the ring itself go." Then, instead of leaving it there, she slipped the ring onto her own finger for the first time. "She sold it so I could have a future," she said. "I don't think she'd want me to leave it behind with the past." August looked down at the matching stone on his own hand, worn smooth after 23 years of never quite being able to take it off. "No," he said softly. "I don't believe she would." The boarding house broke ground that same summer, on a corner lot 2 streets from the saloon, funded by the restored Sterling land, and built, at Rosalind's insistence, with a proper kitchen, large enough to feed anyone who came through the door hungry, whatever they could or couldn't pay. August helped raise the frame himself, alongside hired carpenters who found it considerably strange at first to have the richest rancher in Texas hauling lumber on his own land, though they stopped remarking on it by the second week, the way people generally do once a thing simply becomes ordinary. An envelope arrived that autumn from the church orphanage, thanking Miss Bell for her contribution toward new beds and winter coats, addressed deliberately to the name she'd grown up under rather than the one she'd been born to, because that was still, she'd made plain to everyone on the ranch, who she meant to remain. Rosalind kept her room above the saloon until the boarding house was finished, and moved into its finest room herself the week it opened, the first guest under her own roof. She visited the ranch most Sundays after that, sat with the account books at August's desk most evenings she stayed late, and let him wait, without complaint, until she'd finished the columns before either of them sat down to supper. Walking back from the cemetery gate that spring afternoon, Rosalind had stopped a few steps ahead of him, glancing back. "Pie?" she said, the words slipping out plainly, without ceremony, the first time either of them had let it stand in the open air between them. August stopped walking. "The wagon's the other way," Rosalind said, nodding toward the road, as though she hadn't just said anything at all worth remarking on. It took him a moment to find his voice. "Then I suppose we'd best go that way," he said, and fell into step beside her. Rosalind Bell carried nothing of her mother's, but a story about a lost ring and a hard winter, until the day she looked up from a coffee cup and saw its match on a stranger's hand. August Renwick spent 22 years believing the woman he loved had simply chosen to leave him, never knowing his own brother had stolen the truth from both of them to protect a fortune built partly on someone else's ruin. What they found, once the truth finally came to light, wasn't a wrong fully undone. It was a father and daughter given the chance, 16 years too late for Evangeline, but not too late for them, to finally build something honest together. One Sunday, one ledger, and one small word at a time. May God bless each and every one of you who listened today. Until next time, keep writing.